I know the bulletins are saying that I'm Pastor Eric. I'm not as good looking. So I'm Pastor Grant, the youth pastor here. And the other thing I just want to say is that this is actually the 10-year anniversary of the very first time I gave a sermon in a congregational context or at a church. So I was beardless then too, so. This sermon is actually going to be a bit more autobiographical than I normally would like, and if at some point you're wondering why is he droning on and on about his stuff, I appreciate that. My advice to you is just be curious and I wonder what this has to do with the scripture and, for that matter, our own lives. So, when you have a minister trapped in your house for either, a dinner, or maybe you've got them at a coffee shop, or maybe even a golf course, don't waste your time asking, so how did you get into ministry? Or, why did you even get into ministry? As well as being a minister, I'm also the manager of cloud data engineering at Blue Cross, and it's a fair question, how did you get into computers? How did you, or even why? And it's a pretty simple thing. Like one day in the early 80s, my mother brought home a computer. I hacked into it right away. I was changing video games and things, and I really liked it. And despite at some point going to college or university and being told I had no aptitude for it, I still returned later, got it, and it's always done well for me, and the rest is history. But my ministry story is way more interesting if you just frame your question a teeny bit differently. Instead of saying, how did you get into ministry, I want you to ask me for my call story. We ministers all have one. Sorry to put you on the spot, Eric, but all of us have a call story. Now, being an ordained minister in the United Methodist Church is far from a rubber stamp process. Aside from being accepted into seminary and actually completing a master's, there's a whole multi-step, multi-year process, which it took me 10 years to actually complete. First, you approach your lead pastor. Then you approach your church and they vote on you. Then you have several meetings with the District Committee of Ordained Ministries, affectionately called DCOM for you guys. This is usually about 10 people, 10 to 12, about half are ministers and half are normal folks. And usually their theology is pretty diverse. And each time during all these steps, you're asked for your call story. By the time you get to DCOM, this, along with other interesting questions, this becomes your first sort of opus. And then, when DCOM decides that you're ready, you then get to move to the Board of Ordained Ministry, which in our case is a statewide level. That's, by the way, Board of Ordained Ministry. Any guesses is the acronym there? Boom. So, they're also 50% ministers, 50% normal people, and they're from all over the state. You then basically submit to writing some papers. You answer several questions to show that you are ready for ministry. And then if you are successful, you gain the reverend title and function as the nearly complete package. But then after a certain period of time, you get to write another series of papers and another series of interviews showing Booms the fruit of your ministry, hopefully validating your call. And in all cases, your call is critically examined. Do you have a call? Are you ready to live out your call? And do you have fruits from your call? Now, I'll tell you my complete call story, but I doubt, even in this cold weather, that you'd actually have the stamina to sit through the whole thing. But I will give you a tiny and important piece. So I believe it was around March of 2010 when I found myself in the basement of a church where I didn't know anyone. It was crowded, and I just wanted to fade into the background. And as you imagine, being 6'9", it's very difficult to fade into any background. And by the way, if you're an alien in a church, and it's a good church, a lot of people will come up to you too, which is not what I wanted either. I just wanted to be sat and left alone. And I just I found the one empty table left, and I just sort of sat there. I jumped at it, and I just sat and waited for this fellowship time to finish. After almost 20 years of working with youth, I was done with youth. I was old. I was angry at the clergy at the last church for letting something kind of go out of control and destroy a successful youth ministry. I was done. Now, I'd already started seminary, but that was not to become a minister. I just wanted to know, what did these ministers know? And I certainly was not going there to become a youth minister. That was not even close to what I wanted. And at this point, I wasn't really interested in getting to know any of the people around me or the ministers at this church. I was just happy to sit by myself and wait for this fellowship time to finish. And then a youth showed up. Now, this youth also had no interest in anybody or any group, and he was also looking for a place to sit. Unfortunately for him, there was only one table left that actually had any seats, and that was mine. So he sat at that table about as far away from me as he possibly could and indicated with pretty strong body language that he's not interested in engaging with me and that I basically don't exist. So don't bother trying to communicate with him. Now, as any youth in Advent knows, and even now some of the young adults, that is ambrosia for me, if that actually happens. That is ambrosia. He was a flame, I was a moth, and I resisted because I didn't want to, but, the challenge was set, and I was up for it. So I started leaning into him, asking him questions, and he gave me the bare minimum answers, those grunts. Not enough to be rude, but nothing to follow up on. Undeterred, I kept at him, going at different angles, and then eventually he cracked, and we started having a great time. We started laughing and talking. Soon we were joined by other youth, and then another. And before I knew it, the whole table was full of youth, and I distinctly heard, "Why aren't you doing this?" It's truly hard to describe. It's not like I actually heard it, right? But I definitely heard it. Why aren't you doing this? And note, by the way, that this wasn't "you should be doing this" or even "do this." Apparently, God also has watched Ted Lasso and is being curious and not judgmental. Why aren't you doing this? And I had no good reason not to do this. So shortly after that, I started my ministry with those youth, and the rest is history, almost. Fun fact, by the way, that same youth I was just talking about last week invited me over to his place to play games with his family. So he's in his 20s now. By the way, he's still not a big fan of churches or people, but that's fine. That's, but anyway. But note the difference between that call story and the computer story. There is a definite call. Why aren't you doing this? And this call, right through my being, you can almost hear the struggle. I'm done. I'm too old. I've been doing this for a long time. Why aren't you doing this? But wait, there's a little bit more. So I've told that particular story. I don't know if I've told it here in a sermon, but I've definitely told it here before. But there's a sequel. Hollywood loves those, right? And so there's my call story, but there's also what I kind of like to call now my recall story, a story never actually told before. So let's advance from 2010 to 2016. 2021. So I came to Advent here in 2016. And honestly, the youth ministry was pretty successful right away. There was good energy, there was good volume of youth, and it had a good mission. There's more to this, but to keep it simple and quick, 2021 was a dark time for me here. COVID had basically wiped out any momentum overnight, and the youth community were unable to meet. Now, I'd already moved my ministry online right away because, I'm a technologist. I've been working from home since 2004, so I have no problem setting up Zoom chat rooms, finding online activities to do. But honestly, shortly, everyone else was jumping online, right? Shortly, everyone else was jumping online. Youth were having school online. They were having all their extracurricular stuff online. They were having even their family meetings and things like that, Thanksgiving, Christmas. They were having these all online. And screen exhaustion, even for this generation, is a thing. And so one by one, they dropped out of the ministry, and I couldn't really blame them. And I was left preaching, as Eric was, preaching into my iPhones and empty pews and delivering packages to houses. It was a tough time. And I do want to point out to the parents, that I was also a parent of a youth in high school at the time and a young adult going to college. So I completely empathize with the struggle of COVID parenting, at least for older teenagers and young college students. And the other thing I will say is I really appreciate Eric's leadership during this time. I felt like Ezekiel in chapter 37, wondering if God could ever breathe life into these dry, dusty bones of my ministry. Now, every year, the district superintendent, Eric's boss, will ask me, "How long are you planning to stay here at Advent?" And every year, I will say, "As long as I'm effective." Sadly for you, I'm not interested in becoming an associate pastor or a lead pastor. I'm not interested in going to churches which have larger groups and somehow getting to the conference. The career trajectory here is pretty simple. As long as I'm effective, I'm quite happy here. Well, in 2021, I did not feel effective. And so, again, likely in March, it was March where I had that first calling. But this time in 2021, I was heading into this church for one of our fabulous staff meetings. We were meeting at that point, but it was socially distanced. And after the meeting, I was going to go grab Eric and have a tough conversation. Now, I believe it is the case that a youth leader usually lasts about 18 months. I've tried to verify that stat a few times since then. It certainly was the case before COVID. And I'd done nearly 4 times that here, so I figured, other youth ministry friends of mine, they were dropping like flies all over the place. And actually, to be honest, some of my pastoral friends too were dropping like flies. It was just a very, very tough time. But I couldn't really remain a youth pastor with no effective youth ministry. So the meeting went the way it usually goes, and then completed, and I got up and I was ready to go and talk to Eric when just distinctly, not yet. Not yet. Equally hard to describe, not yet. And I got angry. In a very biblical sense, by the way, if you ever read those stories where people are arguing with God, it was very much of an Abrahamic idea for me here. It's like, I said, what do you mean not yet? I mean, are you waiting for me to have negative youth numbers? I mean, what are you waiting for, Can anything good come from this ministry? Wait and see, right? Wait and see, not yet. So I made what I call a deity deal. I basically said, okay, I will give you 1 year. If there are no fruits, I'm well and truly done. And needless to say, I didn't resign that year. I didn't even have to wait that long, because I didn't have to wait that long for the budding of some fruit. And you can actually thank these guys. That summer, grad parties were just starting to come back, and I went to a couple. And the first one, Carolyn Kerner came up to me so excited that Eric would finally be able to join the youth ministry. The next grad party, Laura Hendrickson came up to me so excited that Max would finally be able to join the ministry. Libby came up, and excited might be a little bit too strong if you know her, but there was definitely something there. There was something there. And then, in the fall of 2021, we had a pretty reasonable if pretty light youth ministry that basically brought us into 2022. And then that summer, though mission trips were still not really a question, I banded together with some of the other remaining youth ministers, and we did Camp MSP, which was a local mission experience. Now, I'd already known Celeste already, but I got to know Minerva better. The Mayor boys came into the ministry. I got to interrogate Pierce and lean heavy into Eric. And while it was a small group, it was a great group, and the die was cast. Come and see. There's more work to do. Moving through these last years, I'm so thankful I didn't leave the youth ministry, because the youth ministry basically is transformed like a phoenix, and there is more to come. Now, what's the point? What's the point? So there's no false modesty in what I'm about to say here. I'm no more special to God than any of you. The Christ revealed in Jesus that calls into my heart is the same Christ that calls to you too. That Christ calling us into ministries is the same calling you to right now to do justice, to love mercy, and walk humbly with God. Christ is calling into our hearts to be disciples, to follow Jesus, and be active participants in the transformation of the world. We would hear if only we had ears to hear, and that was a topic left for Eric for next week. And it is by answering this call, we not only transform the world around us, but ourselves as well. So I wonder what would happen if I had just let God's call go to voicemail, if I just didn't pick up. All those laughs, those smiles, the stories, the tears, the incredibly impactful conversations, the dumb jokes, and the smelly socks. I'm tempted to list all the youth here at Advent that have impacted me as I've seen Christ shine through them. but it would probably stress your patience, and I'm sure. And I'm also honored that some youth have even now, even in their early 20s, will still reach out, go for coffee, and we can continue our journey together. So what's in store for you? I hope you know this is not a call for you to all go to seminary and become ordained pastors. This is not a sermon about how great I am or about how wonderful our church youth ministry is becoming. God is calling each of you right now to be active agents in God's ever-evolving creation. So I wonder what is in store for you when you answer the call. Come and see. You will see greater things than these. Amen.